You're not gonna believe what I just read, Agios. Mandy's voice crackled through the receiver, a mix of excitement and unease. Agios leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. The nameplate on the door of AG Investigations glinted in the dim light of their office, the words Agios Sophia standing tall in black letters against the frosted glass. He took a drag from his cigarette, the smoke swirling around his face like a miniature mist. Spit it out, Mandy. The whole town's talking about it, she began. Her voice a tad too loud, echoing down the line. They say good old Kingsport's got a vampire problem, and it's all tied to this chapel on the hill. There's a priestess up there, keeps them at bay with some kind of nightly ritual. Agios's eyes narrowed, the cigarette smoke stinging his eyes. Priestess, you say? And what ancient deity does she serve? Mandy flipped through the pages of the book she'd found at the local library, her voice hushed. Her name's Lenatia. They say she's the last of her kind, praying to an old goddess to keep the vampires out. Agios stood, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. We're gonna have a chat with this priestess. Could be our key to understanding what's happening here. He grabbed his shotgun and holstered it over his shoulder, the weight a comforting presence. The sun had fully set by the time they drove the scenic winding road around the bay and across the rickety old bridge that connected ancient Kingsport to the mainland. They reached the Tree of Life Inn just as the last rays of light dipped behind the crags of the icy mountainscape. The wooden sign swung lazily in the breeze, the only sound in the eerie quiet that had settled over Kingsport. Mandy's eyes darted to the shadows that danced along the cobblestone streets as they approached. The mist grew denser, wrapping around them like a damp blanket that seemed to muffle their footsteps. Omarina, the innkeeper's daughter, met them at the door with a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked tired, her eyes sunken with dark circles. "Welcome to Kingsport," she said, her voice a whisper. "I hope you enjoy your stay, despite the recent troubles." She handed them their keys and nodded towards the stairs. "Your rooms are up there." The inn itself was a quaint place, but the air was thick with tension. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the ancient tapestries seem to dance in a macabre ballet. The floorboards creaked under their feet as they made their way to the staircase. Agios felt a cold chill run down his spine, a feeling that was more than just the dampness of the night, seeping through the walls. "You okay?" Mandy asked, noticing his furrowed brow as she followed him up the stairs. Agios nodded curtly, just the usual pre-case jitters, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his words. The stench of damp earth and decay grew stronger as they ascended. They reached their adjoining rooms and Agios opened the door to his. It was simple yet comforting, with a 4-poster bed and a small window that looked out over the town. The curtains billowed slightly with the mist that seeped in through the cracks, casting ghostly patterns on the floorboards. Mandy's room was similar, though her curiosity was piqued by the peculiar book on the nightstand. It was bound in leather, its pages yellowed with age, titled Chronicles of the Night. She picked it up, her heart racing as she thumbed through the dense text, finding passages about the very goddess they were there to protect. The words spoke of ancient incantations and the power of the priestess to wield the barrier. The dinner bell tolled, echoing through the silent town, and they descended the stairs to find a meal laid out in the inn's dining room. The few patrons spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the windows as if expecting something to smash through at any moment. The food was hot and flavorful, but the atmosphere was as thick as the mist outside. Marina joined them, her eyes never leaving the door. She spoke in a low voice. "The priestess, she's all we have. If she's harmed, the vampires will flood the town." Her words sent a shiver down Mandy's spine. Agios took a deep breath. The smell of garlic heavy in the air. "We'll pay her a visit tomorrow, during the day. Maybe we can get a sense of the situation." He glanced at Mandy, who nodded solemnly, her eyes still glued to the book. They turned in early, the weight of the impending night pressing down on them in their separate rooms. They could hear the distant howl of the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves that seemed to carry a sinister undertone. Agios lay in the dark, listening, his hand resting on the cool metal of his shotgun. Mandy sat at her window, the curtains drawn aside, her mind racing with thoughts of the priestess and the vampires that lurked beyond the mist. The night grew long, the hours stretching out like the shadows that clung to the corners of their rooms. The tension grew palpable as the clock chimed midnight, the sound echoing through the silent inn. It was then that they heard it, a faint chanting that grew louder with each passing minute, seeping through the walls and into their very souls. Agios rose from his bed, the cold floorboards biting at his bare feet as he made his way to the adjoining door. He pushed it open gently, not wanting to disturb Mandy, but found her already dressed and ready, the derringer in her hand. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to go to the chapel," she whispered, the book still clutched to her chest. "In the middle of the night," Agios replied, rather stupefied. Mandy simply nodded, and so Agios quickly got dressed, keeping his annoyance to a mumble. They made their way through the inn, their breaths the only sounds in the stifling silence. The stairs groaned under their weight as they descended into the lobby, the grandfather clock ticking away the moments like the heartbeat of the very house itself. The front door creaked open, the mist swirling in, wrapping around them like icy tendrils. They stepped out into the night, the cobblestone street glistening with the dampness that hung in the air. The walk to the chapel was a journey through a dreamscape of shifting shadows and whispers on the wind. The mist thickened as they climbed the hill, obscuring the moon's feeble light. The chanting grew louder, a discordant melody that seemed to resonate with the very stones beneath their feet. As they approached the chapel, the trees lining the path bent and twisted as if in pain, their branches gnarled and reaching for the sky. The building itself loomed ahead, ancient and foreboding, a silent sentinel against the inky backdrop of the night. It felt like a miracle that they had arrived without incident. The heavy oak door stood ajar, the gap just wide enough to allow the flickering candlelight to spill out into the mist. Agios took the lead, pushing the door open slowly. The smell of incense and the faint scent of coppery blood filled the air. Inside the chapel was a tableau of chaos. The priestess, her robes torn and her body bruised, lay slumped against the altar, the barrier's power fading from her trembling fingers. Mandy's eyes went wide with horror as she took in the scene. "We're too late," she whispered, the book in her hand shaking. Agios's jaw clenched, his gaze sweeping the room for any sign of the attackers. The candles flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. He stepped over the shattered remnants of the sacred barriers. each one a symbol of the priestess's tireless vigilance, now broken and useless. "Mandy, stay with her," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. "I'll check the perimeter." He slipped into the mist, his form disappearing as quickly as the vampires had. The priestess stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open to reveal a haunted gaze that spoke of the horrors she had faced. Mandy knelt beside the priestess, her hand on the woman's shoulder. "You're safe," she murmured. Though her own heart hammered in her chest, he helped Mandy to her feet and gently lifted the priestess, carrying her back through the mist-covered streets, her head lolling with each step they took. The chanting had stopped, leaving an eerie silence that seemed to stretch for miles.
Raced, piecing together the puzzle laid before them. "The book," she murmured, her eyes flicking to the leather-bound tome she held tightly. "We need to find a way to restore her power or perform the ceremony ourselves." Adios nodded grimly, his eyes never leaving the shadows that danced around the edge of the crowd. "We'll need to get her somewhere safe first. The vampires will be watching." They managed to get the priestess back to the Tree of Life Inn, her body a testament to the brutality of the night's events. The townsfolk followed, their whispers of fear and uncertainty a stark contrast to the diminishing etched on Adios and Mandy's faces. They settled her into a room, the townsfolk offering whatever medical supplies they could spare. Marina hovered in the doorway, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and terror. "Oh, Marina," Agios called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "We need to gather everyone. We have to prepare." Her eyes snapped to his, nodding firmly. "I'll do it," she said before disappearing into the mist-filled night. Adios turned back to the priestess, who lay in the bed, her breathing shallow and ragged. He took her hand in his, feeling the coldness seep through her skin. "You need to rest," he said gently. "We'll figure this out." Mandy laid the book on the small table by the bedside, her mind racing with the incantations and rituals she had read about. "We can do this," she murmured to herself, more for reassurance than anything else. "We have to." The townsfolk gathered in the inn's lobby, their faces a canvas of fear and doubt. Agios stood before them, his broad shoulders squared, and his voice clear. "We don't have much time," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "But we do have one thing the vampires don't expect. We have each other." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We will stand together and fight for Kingsport." Mandy sat beside the priestess, her eyes never leaving the flickering candle on the nightstand. The priestess stirred, her breathing growing more labored. "The ceremony," she gasped, "it must be done before dawn. The prophecy, it's already begun." Agios stepped closer, his expression tightening. "We'll do it," he said firmly, "but we need to know how." The priestess nodded weakly, her eyes closing for a moment before she began to speak again. "The ceremony is complex, but the essence is simple. It requires a pure heart and a bond with the goddess. I can guide you through it, but you must find the sacred artifacts, the dagger of dawn and the chalice of twilight." Mandy's heart raced as she scribbled down the instructions, her mind reeling with the gravity of their situation. "We'll get them," she assured the priestess, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We'll do whatever it takes." Agios turned to the gathering crowd. "We need to split up into groups and search for these artifacts. Time is of the essence." The townsfolk nodded in agreement, their fear momentarily over-reddened by the urgency of the task. Mandy looked down at the priestess, whose eyes had closed again, her breathing barely audible. She squeezed her hand gently. "We won't let you down," she whispered. The townspeople dispersed into groups, armed with torches and makeshift weapons. The air was thick with a sense of dread, the mist seeming to pulse with malicious intent. Agios pulled Mandy aside. his gaze intense. "We'll take the north side of town, closest to the cemetery. That's where we're most likely to find the artifacts." Mandy nodded, her hand tight around the derringer. "Be careful," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate for the danger they were about to face. They stepped out into the mist, the cold air a stark contrast to the warmth of the inn, their footsteps.
His shotgun bellowing a second time, the silver-tipped slugs tearing in the creature's torso. It screeched in agony before collapsing into a pile of decaying flesh. He moved swiftly, the mist parting before him as he made his way back to the crypt. His instincts told him that Mandy needed his help. Adios nodded, his eyes scanning the rows of weathered headstones. "We'll split up," he decided. "You check the crypt, I'll search the outskirts." Mandy's heart hammered in her chest as she approached the crypt. The mist parting briefly to reveal its ominous entrance, the iron door was rusted. But with a firm push, it swung open with a mournful groan. The air was stale, the scent of earth and decay stronger here than anywhere else in the cemetery. She stepped inside, her torch casting eerie shadows on the damp walls. The crypt was a small chamber with a single sarcophagus at its center. The lid was a slab of stone etched with symbols she recognized from the book. Mandy took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She pushed with all her strength, the muscles in her arms straining until finally, the stone slid aside with a grating sound that echoed through the chamber inside. Nestled among the dusty remains was the dagger of dawn, its gleaming silver blade untouched by time. She reached in, her hand trembling as she grasped the hilt. It was cold to the touch, almost as if it were alive. As she pulled it out, a sudden gust of wind extinguished her torch, plunging her into absolute darkness. The silence was shattered by a low growl, the sound vibrating through the very ground beneath her. She fumbled for her gun, her heart racing as she spun around, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The crypt was still, the mist thickening around her. Was it just her imagination playing tricks on her, or had something followed her in? Adios' footsteps grew distant as he searched the outskirts of the cemetery. The mist thickened around him, obscuring his vision. He felt a strange tingle in his spine, a premonition of danger closing in. He paused, straining his ears, and heard it. The faint sound of shuffling, the rustle of fabric against stone. His hand tightened on the grip of his shotgun, his breath slow and steady. He waited, the cold metal against his cheek, his eyes scanning the swirling mist for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog, tall and gaunt, with eyes that gleamed like polished marble in the moonless night. It was one of the vampires, its fangs bared in a snarl, the smell of the grave wafting from its gaping maw without a word. Adios nodded, his eyes scanning the rows of Astadios. His eyes on the Kirnder Soru, the priest to the Henfert and Munki, the Semaperim, it's the grain, the diggers, the furdes pitolas eppainen, that the kumptes breath contain vin je dest kaperning to the perning into then. Adios med enand in his eyes scanning her from head to toe. Find anything. Mandy held up the chalice, the light from the moon reflecting off its gleaming surface. The chalice, she managed to get out, her voice trembling. But we need to hurry.
They sprinted through the mist, the cold metal of the artifacts seeming to pulse with urgency. The town was eerily quiet. The only sounds, the echo of their footsteps and the distant howling of the vampires. The tree of life inn loomed before them, a beacon of warmth in the cold night. Mandy burst through the doors, the chalice clutched tightly to her chest. The townsfolk were huddled together, their faces etched with fear. "We found them," she called out, her voice hoarse from the run. "We can perform the ceremony." Agios followed closely, the dagger glinting in the candlelight. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the priestess, who was paler and weaker than when they had left her. "We must act quickly," he said, his voice urgent. "Dawn is approaching." The priestess managed a weak nod, her eyes flickering open. "Bring the artifact," she whispered, her hand outstretched. Mandy placed the chalice into her trembling palm, and Agios handed her the dagger. With a deep breath, the priestess began to chant, the ancient language rolling off her tongue with surprising strength. The air in the room grew heavy, the candles flickering erratically as an unseen force coalesced around them. The townsfolk watched in awe, their fear momentarily forgotten, as they bore witness to the power of the sacred ritual. Mandy and Agios exchanged a tense glance, the reality of the situation settling heavily on their shoulders. They had to trust in the priestess and the strength of their makeshift alliance. The night had already claimed too much, and the thought of the vampires descending upon Kingsport once the barrier was gone was almost too much to bear. The priestess's chant grew stronger, her voice resonating through the inn as she called upon her ancient goddess for protection. The air grew colder, the mist outside pressing against the windows like a living entity seeking entry. The townsfolk gathered closer, their faces a mix of hope and desperation. Agios kept watch at the door, his shotgun at the ready, his eyes scanning the mist for any signs of movement. The vampires would not wait for the sun to rise. They knew the ceremony was their last hope. Mandy's eyes never left the priestess as she recited the incantation, her voice growing stronger with each word. The air in the room grew colder, the candle flames dancing wildly as a sudden gust of wind tore through the chapel. The townsfolk gasped, their eyes wide with terror as the windows rattled in their frames. "Hold the barrier," the priestess rasped, her strength waning. "It's almost done." Agios tightened his grip on the dagger, the power of the artifact resonating through him. His eyes never left the mist, his senses heightened, waiting for the first sign of an attack. The wind grew stronger, the candles flickering like trapped fireflies in a tempest. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching into an eternity. The priestess' chant reached a crescendo, her eyes never leaving the priestess's face as she chanted. The priestess' breathing grew shallower, her grip on the dagger slipping. Agios stepped forward, taking the priestess's hand in his, feeling the icy chill of her skin. "Stay with us," he murmured, his own voice filled with the power of the incantation. The priestess' eyes fluttered open, a spark of life returning to them as she whispered the final words of the incantation. The chalice began to glow, the light seeping into Mandy's hand and up her arm, filling her with an energy she had never felt before. It was as if the very essence of the goddess had entered the room, standing with them against the tide of darkness.
The outside grew denser. Pressing against the inn walls as if seeking entry, Agios could hear the faint whispers of the vampires, their hunger a palpable force in the stillness. He stepped back, the shotgun held firmly in his hand, his eyes never leaving the door. Mandy's voice grew stronger, the ancient words rolling off her tongue with surprising ease. The chalice in her hand blazed with an ethereal light, casting an eerie glow over the room. The townsfolk watched, their faces a tableau of hope and horror. Suddenly, the doors burst open, the wood splintering under the force of the vampire's onslaught. Agios stepped in front of the priestess and Mandy, the silver dagger reflecting the candlelight in a deadly dance. The vampires surged forward, their fangs bared and eyes glowing with malevolent intent. The first vampire lunged at Agios, but he was ready, sidestepping the attack with a grace that belied his size. He brought the dagger down in a swift arc, slicing through the creature's neck with a spray of blackened blood.
The vampire's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless once more. Mandy's chant grew more intense, her eyes squeezed shut as she focused on the ceremony. The chalice in her hand grew hotter, the light within it pulsing in time with her racing heartbeat. The vampires grew more frenzied, their hisses and snarls filling the air as they fought to break through Agios' steadfast defense. Agios felt the priestess's hand tighten on his, her strength seemingly returning with each passing moment. "The barrier holds," she murmured, a hint of triumph in her voice. "But we must finish quickly." The vampires grew bolder, their numbers increasing with every heartbeat. They were relentless, pushing against Agios with a ferocity that was almost overwhelming. But he held firm, each swing of the dagger a silent promise that they would not pass. Mandy's voice grew louder, the ancient incantation filling the inn with a power that seemed to pulse through the very air. The chalice in her hand was now a beacon, casting shadows that danced and writhed on the walls. The townsfolk watched in awe, their fear momentarily forgotten in the face of the sacred ritual unfolding before them. The vampires at the door grew more frenzied, their eyes locked on the priestess and the two humans wielding the sacred artifacts. The mist outside thickened, reaching in through the open doorway like tendrils seeking to strangle the light from within. Mandy's voice grew stronger with each word of the incantation, her eyes snapping open to meet Agios' determined gaze. The light from the chalice grew blinding, casting Agios' shadow across the room, his every movement a dance of life and death. The priestess, revitalized by the ceremony, took the dagger from Mandy and sliced her palm, letting her blood dribble into the chalice. The room grew colder, the very air seeming to shiver with anticipation. The vampires at the door stumbled back, their hisses turning to shrieks as the light from the chalice grew too intense for their sensitive eyes. The mist retreated, revealing the horror of their distorted faces, contorted with rage and pain. Agios stepped aside, allowing Mandy and the priestess to stand before the door, the chalice a symbol of their unyielding resolve. Mandy's voice grew stronger, each syllable of the ancient language a declaration of their intent. The light from the chalice grew brighter, the power within it pulsing with every beat of her heart. The priestess raised the dagger, her voice joining Mandy's in a harmonious duet of power and protection.
Agios could feel the vampires' rage, building outside their hunger a tangible force that seemed to push against the chapel walls. Yet with every word they spoke, the barrier grew stronger, the light from the chalice casting them back. He braced himself, his eyes never leaving the doorway as he listened to the sacred chant. The priestess raised the chalice high, her blood mingling with the light to form an arcane barrier around the room. The vampires shrieked in agony, their forms flickering like candles in a storm. As the light touched them, Mandy's voice grew louder, the incantation reaching its climax. The power in the room was almost too much to bear, the very air crackling with energy. The barrier grew stronger, pushing the vampires back until they were nothing but shadows against the mist. The townsfolk watched, their eyes wide with hope and fear, as the light grew so intense that it seemed to consume the very darkness itself. The priestess staggered, her strength waning, but Mandy's voice remained unyielding. Agios could feel the power of the ritual coursing through him. Bolstering his own resolve with a roar, he stepped forward, the dagger in his hand seemingly aflame with holy light. The vampires recoiled, their shadows retreating before the combined might of the humans and their sacred artifacts. Mandy's chant reached a crescendo, the chalice pulsing with an intensity that was almost blinding.
The priestess stumbled, her strength draining away with each word, but Mandy caught her, continuing the incantation. The light grew brighter still, pushing the vampires back into the mist, their cries of rage fading into the night. With a final desperate effort, Mandy and the priestess completed the ceremony. The chalice flared, a brilliant beam of light shooting into the sky, piercing the heart of the dark cloud that had enveloped Kingsport. The mist retreated, revealing the town untouched, as if the very earth had rejected the vampire's foul presence. The townsfolk let out a collective sigh of relief, their eyes still fixed on the two women standing before the shattered doorway. The priestess slumped into Mandy's arms, her strength spent, but the glow of victory on her face. The vampires had been repelled, their plan to destroy the town thwarted. Agios stepped outside, the dagger and chalice in hand, and surveyed the retreating mist. The vampires had disappeared into the night, their shrieks of defeat echoing in the distance. The tension in the air dissipated, replaced by a sense of profound relief. The townsfolk slowly emerged from their homes, their faces a mix of amazement and gratitude as they saw the two guardians standing firm against the night's horrors. Word of the successful ceremony spread like wildfire, and soon the townspeople were gathering in the central square before the Tree of Life Inn. They brought forth torches and lanterns, their faces alight with joy as they celebrated the victory over the undead scourge. The sound of laughter and music began to fill the late night, a stark contrast to the dread that had so recently held them in its grip. Agios and Mandy emerged from the inn, the priestess leaning heavily on them both. She looked up at the clearing sky, the moon now a benign presence, and offered a weak smile. "The goddess Hecate has heard us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of the celebration.